Hi. If you are watching, this is Wednesday, June 19th. I have 2 days left of advanced classes, so I'm just gonna go ahead and finish out June so I can focus on the rest of summer. So this is opponents of maintaining zoos. So I'm gonna grab your attention pretty quickly here and share with you the video of probably what sparked a conversation about what really goes on behind closed doors at zoos. So I'm going to share the screen. A very famous video. A lot of memes on the internet.
Oh my God, I know.
Was a 12-year-old boy, buried, fell 12 feet into the moat, into the gorilla cage.
Oh my God. Everybody back up. I'll take you. Okay. He's right here. I'm right here. Thank you for coming.
Was him screaming. Okay, so you do have the link to that video. It's a little bit hard to watch, but it is the lead to your essay today because this is the most talked about incident probably in zoological history. And if you think about it, the timing of it, this happened on May 28th, 2016. How come we hadn't seen things like this before? Well, this is the time period when everyone started to record. Everyone had a camera on their iPhone and everyone started recording things. So at the time that this incident happened, this was deemed a life-threatening event. Obviously, that gorilla could have just sat on him and killed him based on the sheer size of him. So the zoo made a decision. They had two options: to tranquilize, put it to sleep, or euthanize, kill it. So they made the decision, even though he wasn't attacking the kid, he was just really kind of playing with it, that he was a significant threat. So they killed him in front of everyone. Yeah. The boy was rescued. He was hospitalized briefly just to check for injuries, but the damage was done. The international news picked up the story and it became an overnight sensation. So many animal advocates began to criticize and argue about the poor handling of the situation. And today, every May 28th, there are internet memes that resurface about Harambe because he remains a primary example of what can happen when zoos focus more on entertaining visitors than caring for the animals. Okay, what do I mean by that? Okay, so if you go to your packet of information, on the first page, it explains, and I had to show you that video because I had to show you the exhibit. The first zoos housed animals behind metal bars and Spartan cages. Well, it turns out visitors don't like that. They like the illusion that this animal is in a natural habitat. Relatively early on in their evolution, a German exotic animal importer named Carl Hagenbeck changed the way wild animals were exhibited. In his animal park, which opened in 1907 in Hamburg, Germany, he designed cages that didn't look like cages, using moats and artificially arranged rock walls to invisibly pen animals, cage animals. By designing these enclosures so that many animals could be seen at once without bars or walls in the visitor's line of sight, he created an immersive panorama in which the fact of captivity was supplanted by the illusion of being in nature. So his model became the model for zoos. Animals were presented with the distasteful fact of their imprisonment camouflaged. Zoos shifted just slightly from overt demonstrations of mastery over beasts to a narrative of benevolent protection of individual animals. From there, it was an easy leap to say that zoos protect animal species. Okay, let's be clear. This is the image most of you have probably grown up with. The image that this is a good civic institution that lovingly cares for animals on its grounds and in their habitats. And zoos, of course, are the first to promote any conservation work. However, there is a dark side to zoos. So we're going to go to the page that says zoos do more harm than good. And here's what it says. Zoos have a dark side. The vast majority of the animals held captive inside their compounds are depressed. They live in perpetual captivity and lack access to all of the things that make life interesting and enjoyable, and often die far earlier than they would have lived in nature. For example, the elephant lives in nature to about 40, half the lifetime. 19 is the oldest in captivity. So why do we keep animals in captivity? Humans keep other animals in zoos for our own convenience. We like animals and we like to be around them, and we like to inconveniently encounter animals without any significant effort on our part. And we capture animals from the wild and lock them up in cages for our amusement. Okay, now I'm not saying we do, but interestingly enough, we are okay with it. So just a couple things about zoos. First and foremost, wild animals are killed and kidnapped to supply zoos. We know this if you've done the proponent side. You know, the capture of animals and selling them to zoos is a lucrative business. Zoos will buy these animals and they'll buy babies. So if they want a baby, a zoo might hire a hunter to kill the parents and then ship the baby. And the babies, you know, removed from their loving parents often die before they reach the zoos. There are brutal invasive techniques to breed animals, and I'll explain one of those in a minute here. But here is the worst. Animals are not allowed to choose their own friends. They are restricted in what they can do and whom they can socialize with. They are separated from their families and friends. The zoo decides who they can mate with or deny them access to a mate if they are not, if they want to breed them in a different way. Animals are not allowed to make their own decisions on how to spend their time. Their movements are limited. Their behaviors, their ability to fully realize their higher order needs, their autonomy is stripped. When animals get old, zoos often decide they're not worth the expense of keeping them. When baby animals are a box office hit. So zoos often kill surplus animals. So just to give you an idea how you know, just horrifying that is, I'm going to give you an example here. In 2014, the director of the European Association for Zoos and Aquariums estimated between 3,000 and 5,000 animals were euthanized in European zoos each year. Early in the pandemic, the German Neumünster Zoo coolly announced their emergency plan to cope with their revenue loss. You know, when people had to stay home, they decided they would feed some of the smaller animals to the bigger animals, compressing the food chain like an accordion, until the worst case scenario, Vitus, a polar bear, would be left standing. The OZA policies allow for euthanasia of animals, but the president of the association, Dan Ash, said it's very rarely employed. So what happens if they're not euthanized? Well, as the rest of the article says, they're sold to hunting ranches. They'd be better off euthanized. A hunting ranch is where hunters you know, put these animals in the wild and go kill them. Medical laboratories they're sold to, or poorly run zoos. Okay, so mounting evidence shows holding an intelligent social animal in captivity is abuse. It is inexcusable cruelty. So what happens when an animal is isolated away from everything it knows and loves? I think we have an idea of that, having faced the pandemic. And there were a lot of cases of kids developing psychiatric issues, anxiety, depression, The isolation is not normal, not for humans and not for animals. So animals develop a condition called zoochosis. It is a mental illness caused by captivity. Stereotypical behaviors are obsessive, compulsive, and repetitive, such as pacing, circling, rocking back and forth, swaying, head bobbing, over grooming, hair pulling, bar biting, excessive licking, vomiting, playing with excrement, eating disorders, addiction, self-harm. If you saw a child pacing back and forth, pulling out his hair, starving herself, rocking back and forth as if in a trance, it would be an indication something was wrong. So it is with animals. But here's the deal. At the end of the day, a zoo is about profit. It's about business. Accordingly, they provide animals with the smallest possible cages, limit access to veterinary care, and do not provide animals with the social companionship that animals need to be happy. Okay, so you're thinking, well, I don't see that when I go see the zoo. You're probably right. You want to know why you don't see it? Because zoos, behind the scenes, use antidepressants, antipsychotics, and tranquilizers to drug the animals during the day when visitors come in to watch them. So they'll sit there. And what we do know, and what has been recorded, is animals are very stressed as soon as those zoos doors open, with the screaming and all the noise, the music, the crowds, very, very stressful. So some animals will act with aggression or depression, and they will have to drug them. Zoos send the wrong message. Zoos teach all of us, especially children who are impressionable, that other animals exist for human entertainment, that it is acceptable to take them from their homes and treat them, lock them up in cages, and not give them the care that they deserve. Zoos are often filled with charismatic megafauna. These are the big animals, the lions, the bears, the giraffes, the elephants, the tigers, the polar bears. The bigger the animal, the worse off they are, the more they're probably being drugged. These animals belong in the wild. When you remove them from their large habitats, which they need to roam, these animals develop the psychosis responses. For example, elephants are a prime example of animals who suffer. It is calculated that zoos in North America would need to import 4 elephants per year to maintain the population at the current level, because deaths of elephants in zoos outnumber births. Zoos are net consumers of elephants rather than guardians of them, as the industry would have us believe. So elephants kept in zoos suffer poor welfare. There is a disease that only happens in captivity. Like, elephants in the wild do not get elephant endotheliotropic herpesivirus hemorrhagic disease, and it kills most babies. Surprisingly, because they walk on concrete, elephants get a condition, arthritis, and get a condition in their legs. They don't get that in the wild. Giraffes. Giraffes, because of their tall neck, have special needs, and unfortunately, they suffer terribly because of their enclosures. In North America, at least 103 zoos hold close to 600 giraffes captive. They are the world's tallest land mammal. Captivity presents multiple welfare issues. They can't roam the great distances they need. Just the act of keeping them in their enclosure, multiple individuals have died. In 2010, a giraffe died at the Cincinnati Zoo when her horns got entangled in netting, and a 3-year-old giraffe at Peoria Zoo got his neck caught in the fork of a tree in the same year. He died in front of visitors flipping over to free himself. Polar bears, the worst off. And they range, the polar bears range can be tens of thousands of miles that they walk each day. I believe they swim 427 miles over 9 days. So what happens is the polar bears enclosure, the water treatment, the climate control, the food production, causes such a horrifying experience for the polar bear that they become depressed, and it's awful. You can see a lot of polar bears displaying zoochosis symptoms. So I want to go to just a really interesting part here that I thought was fascinating too. Animals escape zoos. Why don't we hear about that? Okay, and why don't we hear about elephants struggling and polar bears and giraffes? They don't want you to know. If you knew, you wouldn't go. You wouldn't buy a ticket. So they don't tell you. And the only reason Harambe became an overnight sensation is because somebody videoed it. Zoos will, if there's an incident in a zoo, they will have you file a non-disclosure agreement and they will pay you millions of dollars. Don't think for a minute that 3-year-old boy and his family didn't make millions of dollars off that. I assure you they did. The zoo was at fault. So Tatiana the tiger was kept in a San Francisco zoo, snapped one day in 2007 after 3 teenage boys had been taunting her. Apparently, they threw sticks and pine cones inside her exhibit. Okay, but if the exhibit was that close to them, they shouldn't have been able to do that. But what they're doing is they're creating enclosures so close to visitors because visitors want to be close. But then this sets up this kind of scene. So Tatiana somehow escaped over a 12-foot wall surrounding her, 1,000 square foot enclosure, attacked one of the teenagers, killing him. The others ran. She pursued them, ignoring all other humans in her path. And when she caught up with the boys at the cafe, she mauled them before she was shot to death by police. She was done. She snapped. Case after case after case. I want to say as also, the worst are you're swimming with dolphins, or your shamus at SeaWorld. Many of you probably have heard of the incident at SeaWorld where a shamu attacked his trainer. What you don't know is those whales were kept in 2/3 of their lives in a 20 by 30 enclosure aquarium, 20 by 30 feet, tiny pool with no light or stimulation when they weren't performing. And they normally swim up to 100 miles a day and dive up to 850 feet. But an orca tank at SeaWorld measures 220 feet wide and is no deeper than 50 feet. That is a cage, any way you slice it. That orca snapped. It had enough, and it had nothing to lose. It probably knew if it attacked the trainer, it was over. Maybe he wanted it to be over, because that's not a life. That's not living. It is grossly unfair to a wild animal to be forced to live under inadequate living conditions, which fail to come close to resembling their natural environment, and all for the sole purpose to entertain people who want to pay a ticket. The other argument I want to explain is to counter what I said week 1 for proponents. And what I said was, our strongest argument was this. Because 700 million people come into zoos each year, there's an opportunity for zoos to educate anyone who walks through their door and to instill in them conservation, animal conservation values, that to care about the animals in their habitats. I'm on page 3 of the 3rd page. There is no unambiguous evidence that zoos are making visitors care about conservation or take any part to support it. More than 700 people visit zoos and aquariums every year, and biodiversity is still in decline. In a 2011 study, researchers quizzed visitors at the Cleveland, Bronx, Prospect Park, and Central Park zoos, asking them about their level of environmental concern and what they thought about the animals. Those who reported a sense of connection to the animals at the zoo walked in that way. They also said they had concerns about the environment. The researchers reported, this is really interesting, there were no significant differences in survey responses before entering an exhibit compared to those obtained as visitors were exiting. Wait, if a zoo is doing its job, educating and creating awareness, they should feel something when they leave. A 2008 study of 206 zoo visitors by some members of the same team showed that while 42% said the main purpose of the zoo was to teach visitors about animals and conservation, 66% of people said their main reason to go was to have a fun outing with family and friends. Only 12% said their intention was to learn about the animals. The researchers also spied on hundreds of visitors' conversations at the Bronx Zoo, the Brookfield Zoo outside Chicago, and the Cleveland Metropark Zoo, and they found only 27% of people bothered to read the signs at exhibits. 27% is not going to make that big of a difference. More than 6,000 comments made by the visitors were recorded, and half of which, 50%, were purely descriptive statements that asserted a fact about the exhibit or the animal. The researchers wrote, in all the statements collected, no one volunteered information that would lead us to believe they had an intention to advocate for protection of the animal or an intention to change their own behavior. People don't go to zoos to learn about the biodiversity crisis or how they can help. They go to get out of the house. They go to get their children some fresh air and to see some interesting animals. They go for the same reason people went to the zoos in the 19th century, to be entertained. Okay, so let's go to your outline here. And I'm going to kind of share the screen here. That up. Okay. So obviously Harambe is our lead. Zoos and aquariums promote their mission, purposely branding themselves. I use that word purposely, branding. We brand ourselves on social media too. Is that real? Or is that scripted? Right? As responsible for educating the public and promoting conservation. However, recent findings show most zoos today make little impact when it comes to instilling animal conservation values in its visitors. And unfortunately, there is no evidence to show zoos can make people care about conservation. So this is everything I just went over with you, number 1 and number 2. And I want to really focus on number 3 because I really kind of was feeling guilty myself here because, wow, was I completely unaware myself? So this really was in the packet. This really made a little bit more sense to me. Human societal views support holding wild animals in captivity. This is because for much of history, the idea has been perpetuated. So people view animals as largely existing for human benefit and entertainment. Because zoos began with wealthy aristocrats who caged wild animals as a show of status and elitism, this established a precedence in cultural thinking. Zoos have evolved over time, and yes, the majority of people support having access to viewing of wild animals, but many people assume animal captivity is normal and acceptable. Let me give you some facts here. A Canadian survey found 62% of people think zoos and aquariums make communities better places to live. Well, remember, 50% of people live in cities. That would make sense. That's their only way to see them. 56% of people think that people learn things at zoos and aquariums that cannot be learned from television. 40% of those people said it is acceptable to keep non-endangered and non-injured animals in captivity. So these are favorable attitudes regarding maintaining zoos, and they will continue to drive the public to continue to support the captive industry without holding any regard for animal conservation. Well, how do I know that? How do I know that? Of the millions of dollars, remember 700 million people go to zoos every year. Think about the price of a ticket. Do the math. They're making millions of dollars. Get this. So I told you, in the proponent side, all the programs that OZA was doing. What I didn't tell you that fewer than 5 to 10% of zoos are involved in wildlife conservation. So this is your OZA accredited zoos. And those that are, spend less than 3% of their annual income on those programs. The majority of profits from zoos are spent on improving the experience for visitors to keep drawing them in. It would appear the mission of most zoos to educate the public and instill conservation ideals is not as important as profiting off of wild animals and running a business. Unfortunately, zoos have a dark side which is hidden from the public, where animals are mistreated, placed in unsuitable living conditions, forced to entertain, and as a result, suffer noticeable physical and mental trauma, dying young. Most zoo animals die, well, all zoo animals, pretty much most, I would probably say 98% will die in the zoo. Most animals are not born. It's no secret. Zoos prefer to hide. It is a secret. Zoos prefer to hide from the public. Wild animals are kidnapped to supply zoos. And they prefer to kidnap young animals. If the parents stand in the way, they hire hunters to kill them. Many of these animals never make it to their final zoo destination and die in transport. If the wild animal does survive, it is placed in less than ideal confining enclosures. Wild experts explain just by keeping a wild animal in captivity, this is a form of abuse or mistreatment. Locking any animal into a restricted environment and forcing them to endure a loss of habitat, separation from family, and placing them in controlled conditions prevents them from thriving. One of the worst forms of mishandling begins with the enclosure. Facilities are built with a focus on entertaining crowds of visitors, so enclosures are often smaller so guests can view the animals up close. As an example, tigers and lions reside in 18,000 times less space in their captive enclosures than they would in the wild. Polar bears endure 1 million times less space. In oceans, orcas have the freedom to swim up to 100 miles a day and dive up to 850 feet, but in captivity, an orca tank measures no more than 220 feet wide and is no deeper than 50 feet. And then here's that SeaWorld example. Consider another fact when visitors arrive: the level of activity, noise rises, stressing these animals out when they have nowhere to escape from it. There are more people who are willing to pay for a personal encounter with a wild animal. For example, swimming with dolphins or riding a camel is good for humans, but stressful for the animals. Even worse, if a wild animal is forced to learn tricks, they're subjected to being forced to perform, which often involves electrical shocks or other threats. Performance animals also suffer because they're unable to feed on a regular schedule. More often than not, these animals are fed only haphazardly during shows when they're given rewards. Whether or not the animal resides in a cage tank or performs, these wild animals are suffering physically and mentally, and it is noticeable. So then here comes in the zoochosis, which I think you could do a whole paragraph on zoochosis. Zoos intentionally seek out charismatic megafauna, the larger animals, and these larger animals suffer the most. Because, you know, the enclosure they're going to put them in cannot simply measure to what their normal habitat would be. So I gave an elephant example, the giraffe example that I'd already gone over with you. The mistreatment of animals in captivity that animals in captivity endure can often result in a variety of physical issues. It is important to note many of the instances of physical harm can result from the psychological issues discussed above. So they can harm themselves, they can self-harm. So there's no way zoos are unaware of the physical and mental stresses placed on wild animals, nor do they seem to care about animal welfare based on documented findings. Ironically, when zoos promote educating the public and wanting them to care about animal conservation, this is the opposite of what is taking place. Wild animals held in captivity suffer awful conditions which the public will never know about, as zoos hide it. Zoos never explain what happens to wild animals when they grow too old or become sick or do not pay off as an attraction for visitors anymore. The sad reality is zoos often kill animals they no longer need. If they can make money from them, zoos will sell them. Cannot make money from them, zoos will sell them to hunting ranches, which allow them to be killed for sport. or they donate them to research laboratories, or worse, sell them cheap to roadside zoos known for abusing animals. If zoos truly advocated for animal conservation and education, they would not be holding wild animals in confined spaces, knowing they suffer physical and mental stress, as this is nothing short of animal cruelty. So one humane solution would be to help wild animals they no longer need and make sure to transition them to wildlife sanctuaries where they will not be sold, bred, traded, or borrowed. Wildlife sanctuaries spend money to keep animals healthy and safe, whereas zoos manipulate and mistreat animals to make a profit without any consideration for their well-being. This sounds like the opposite of a zoo's mission statement of education and animal conservation. The actual best solution is to create a virtual zoo, a documentary film footage which would allow wild animals to be viewed in their natural habitats on film. As long as people flock to zoos, they will remain open, and nothing will be done to stop the vicious cycle of abuse of wild animals held in captivity. Yeah, that's a rough one. Okay. So this is a great example, ladies and gentlemen, of pathos. When you can argue and make the person feel emotion, that's an effective argument. Ethos, pathos, logos. This is pathos, emotional appeal. So those of you who are doing a one body paragraph, my new ones, please do body paragraph number 2. That is your strongest argument. All right. Thank you for watching. This concludes Opponents of Maintaining Zoos. Have a great day.